So this is the first lecture of a 7-part series by Rabbi Lawrence Troster of Kesher Israel Congregation in Westchester, Pennsylvania, called Who Wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? And in this series of lectures and a text study, we are going to look at the community that wrote the scrolls. And what do we know about them, who they were, and what is the historical context in which these were written. So I'm going to begin, and some of you may see a few things from the last class when we looked at the biblical text. We did have a session on the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it's going to be a little different in terms of our emphasis. So just as a bit of a review, there is Qumran, and Qumran is the site of where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. You'll see that it's very close to the Dead Sea, and from Jerusalem to Qumran, the land slopes down quite a bit. The Dead Sea is the lowest part on earth, and the land there is very dry because there's a rain shadow on the ridge that Jerusalem is on, and very little rain gets east of Jerusalem. Very little rain. It's very dry. Okay, so these other sites, excuse me, are places where other scrolls or other documents were found. Most of them are not germane to the community at Qumran. They are later, and usually these are called, more technically, instead of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they are called the scrolls from the Judean desert, which covers all these different sites. You'll notice Masada, of course, when Masada was excavated by Yigal Yadin in the early 60s. They actually did find some documentary material there. And what's interesting is that some of the material there matches some of the material at Qumran, which suggests that somebody from Qumran was also at Masada. We'll get to that because that's a very interesting possibility. So these are where the texts were found. Now, at Qumran, all kinds of material was found. Some of it in scroll form, some of it in tiny fragments which had to be pieced together like jigsaw puzzles. A lot of the scrolls had deteriorated, so some of them are literally just fragments with a few sentences or a few words in some case. And 40% of all the material found at Qumran were texts of the Hebrew Bible. Okay, that's the largest part of the material. 30% are texts from books from the Second Temple period, which were not written by the people at Qumran, but they had it, like they had biblical texts. And these are texts that were not ultimately put into the Hebrew Bible. This includes the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Tobit, the Wisdom of Sirach, and some non-canonical Psalms. I can do that. All right, so 30% of the texts are texts from the Second Temple period that were not written at Qumran. Another 30% are sectarian manuscripts that we are assuming were written by the people at Qumran. That is the general assumption. But they are previously unknown documents. In other words, except for one of them, nobody had ever seen them before. And the assumption is that they were written by the group that was living at Qumran when Qumran was destroyed by the Romans around the year 70. And they include the community rule, the war scroll, the Damascus Document, which has its own interesting history. And those are the texts we're going to look at. We're going to look at the texts that we theorize were written by the people who are actually at Qumran. So this is, of course, one of the biblical texts, the most complete scroll, the Isaiah scroll, written around 125 BCE. Here is a fragment of the Book of Enoch, from the end of the 1st century BC. The Book of Enoch is one of those non-canonical books that we have in other languages that survived the ancient world, but this is from probably the original, which was in Aramaic. And here is the temple scroll, one of the oldest scrolls found at Qumran, unknown until it was found, but it predates the community that lived there. In other words, this was a book that predates them, but they venerated. We'll talk about it, but this is probably not written by the people who lived at Qumran. And it's one of the oldest manuscripts that was found at Qumran and one of the most complete. The most interesting story in terms of the manuscripts is of the Damascus Document. Now, the Damascus Document is one of two documents which tell the rules of the community. In other words, they're handbooks on how do you become a member of this community, what you have to do, the initiations, and so on and so forth. The fascinating thing is that several parts of the Damascus Document, the most complete we have, were found in the Cairo Geniza, which is in an old synagogue in Cairo that was preserved in the Middle Ages. So this manuscript of the Damascus Document from the Qumran people somehow survived somewhere and was written and written and written, and there is a manuscript from the 10th or 11th century that was discovered at the beginning of the 20th century by Solomon Schechter, who founded the modern conservative movement. And when Schechter read this document, he knew it must have referred back to some ancient unknown group. And in fact, a couple of other scholars wrote about the Damascus Document, and their theories about the group were pretty accurate when it comes, because just from this text alone, they theorized the existence of this unknown, rather ascetic group. Well, in Qumran itself, there are fragments of the Damascus Document. So how did the Damascus Document get from Qumran in the 1st century CE, 1,000 years later, to be deposited in the Cairo Geniza? Nobody knows. In other words, somehow a copy of it survived, got copied, and ended up in the Cairo Geniza, where it was discovered in the beginning of the 20th century. So the Damascus Document is one of the most critical texts that we have of the Qumran community because it tells the rules of the community. There's another text called the Community Rule, which is also similar but not exactly the same. Anybody have any questions at this particular point?
Just one brief one. When you're talking community, are you talking sort of like akin to citizenship or nationality kind of thing?
No, we're talking about the community that was at this place. They, to put it in the best possible terms, it was a monastery. It was a Jewish monastery before there was a Christianity and Christian monasticism, because there were what we would call monastics in the ancient world that predate Christianity. This was a group of Jewish ascetics who called themselves, in the documents themselves, they called themselves the Yachad, which is the Hebrew word for together, which can be translated as community. And it was about their community. Now, the site of Qumran, remember, the scrolls are found in caves adjacent to the site itself. And the assumption is that they were hidden in there when the Roman army was coming into the area during the war. And that's why some of them survived so intact. It's evident that a couple of the caves were set on fire by the Romans, very likely. But this is, and there's been extensive archaeological excavations at Qumran, several of them, since the place was originally found in the late 40s. And this is a reconstruction of what it looked like. So you see it had a wall around it. It had a kitchen. It had a laundry. There was a room that they called the scriptorum, which is what, in medieval monasteries, that's where the monks wrote manuscripts. There's pretty good evidence that's where they wrote the manuscripts. They had an extensive water system to supply water for the community, as well as for mikvahs. Okay? And you'll notice it says Essene settlement. We will get back to that. But this is a nice reconstruction of it. But online, from the University of California, there is something called Virtual Qumran, where they have taken all the archaeological stuff, taken pictures of the ruins, and they have reconstructed visually or virtually what it looked like. So this is all computer generated. And it's probably, 95% accurate. And it's like a monastery. This is the scriptorum. They found little inkwells in there and other things. There's an oven. They made there was a lot of pottery made there, which is part of the controversy over what exactly it is. This is the dining room.
Were there any women?
Not at this settlement. No. But that's an interesting issue because they were celibates. Actually, this is the scriptorum, sorry. You can see that's how they would have kept the scrolls in a cabinet like that because they didn't have, what we call books. Everything was written on scroll, so they would have had some kind of cabinet like that. There was a tower on the, which was a protective tower. This is one of the water courses and the mikvahs. This is looking towards the caves, which are in the background. And this is another view showing again the cliffs where the caves are. There's another picture of one of their water courses. So this is a quite amazing project that they did at UCLES.
Is this a result of excavations in that area?
Yes, this is a reconstruction of it based on excavations and what we know about buildings from that period of time, what they would have looked like, what they were made out of. So it's a very amazing reconstruction. But this gives you a flavor as to what we're talking about when we speak about the community at Qumran. This is the way their storage would have looked. These jars are what they kept a lot of different kinds of things in. I mean, these look so real, like you expect to see people walking in them.
What is the source of their water supply? You indicated that there was water there, but in the middle of the desert, I wouldn't expect to find that.
Because even in that part of the country, there is rain in the rainy season, and they would collect it through a series of aqueducts and other things that would lead into cisterns and pools. That's what the same thing at Masada. If you've seen the giant cisterns at Masada, there's no spring on Masada, but they would, during the rainy season, they had created a way to collect all the rain that fell on it and go into giant cisterns in the ground.
Amazing engineering feat.
Well, that was what they did in ancient times. So here's sort of another aerial view. You can see what it looks like. Okay, so any questions at this particular point?
Were there such vegetation in that desert area?
Yes, they're palm trees. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so if you take a look at the material, yes, Burr.
You may get to it, but what was there? We showed the writing room. Who are they writing for?
Well, first of all, they were writing copies of biblical manuscripts and non-canonical works for themselves, and their own particular books for themselves in order to preserve their sacred writings, which included, of course, all the books of the Hebrew Bible, except for the Book of Esther. They have not found any pieces of the Book of Esther, but these writings were important to them. We're assuming the biblical texts were considered sacred. They obviously liked the Book of Enoch and Jubilees and these things, and then they had their own books. And what was the status of their own books? Were they considered to be as holy as the biblical text? That's a question we really don't know. We really don't know.
Is there any sense of the number of people who were there?
Yes, several hundred. Not more than that. Okay? It wasn't a big community. But that may not have been all of them. That may, as when we get to it, this may have been, as it were, the mother church of the group. And they had small little communities elsewhere in the land. If if we assign them to being Essenes, there's a good chance that this was kind of their headquarters, and they had little communities all around the countryside, okay, that were not cut off and separate, but were part of other communities. So if you take a look at the material, I've given you a timeline just to get a sense of the period. And we are talking here the Second Temple period, which means from around 539 BCE, 538, to 70 CE. That 500-year period is what we call the Second Temple period. The first temple, built by Solomon around the year 1000 BCE, or 950, is destroyed in 586 by the Babylonians, and the Judeans go into exile. What happens is, when the Babylonian Empire is conquered by the Persians, Cyrus the Great, the Persian emperor, allows the Judeans to go back to their land, rebuild Jerusalem, and rebuild the temple. Okay, so there are various waves of the returnees from Babylon. It takes them quite a while to finish the temple. And in 444 BCE, Nehemiah, who is appointed by who is a Judean from Babylon, he is appointed by the Persian emperor to be the governor in Judea. And during his time there in 444 BCE is the first known public reading of the Torah, probably pretty much the way we have it. Now, in the late 4th century BCE, or the last third of it, Alexander the Great attacks the Persian Empire and conquers all of the Persian Empire. And he dies only after a short period of time, and his empire is divided up amongst his generals. And this is usually referred to as the Hellenistic period. And here are the different parts of the Hellenistic kingdoms. So the general who got Egypt and what is now Eretz Yisrael and Jordan and parts of Lebanon and some other pieces here was a guy named Ptolemy the First. And he established the dynasty of the Ptolemies that lasted from then until the time of Cleopatra, when the Romans took over directly, ruling Egypt. What you had is a large part of the previous empire, which is called the Seleucid Kingdom. And then there are other Greek states, and this part here is what is called the Antigonide Kingdom. In other words, so it was divided up, and as soon as it was divided up, they started fighting each other. And the biggest fights were between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And the battleground, you might say, is the land of Israel, because control of this territory controls the roads into Egypt and also the Eastern Mediterranean. Okay? So if you take a look at it, you will see that up until around the year 200 BCE, Judea is under Ptolemaic rule, and it is during this period that numbers of Jews are brought by the Ptolemies initially and then emigrated to Egypt and refound a major community in Egypt, especially in the city of Alexandria. So over the Second Temple period, the latter half of it, there is a very large Greek-speaking Jewish community that grows up in Egypt. What happens in the year 200 is that the Seleucids defeat the Ptolemies in a major battle and take over the land of Israel, so that Israel from around 200 is under Seleucid rule. And it is that period in which the Hanukkah story takes place, the story of the Maccabees. So Antigonus IV, who is the Seleucid emperor, in 168, initiates a series of persecutions, and there's all kinds of theories about that, and that leads to the outbreak of the Maccabean Revolt, whereby the Maccabeans in 164 they defeat the various armies that the Seleucids had sent against them. They defeat them, and under the leadership of Judah the Maccabee, and they rededicate the temple, and they found the holiday of Hanukkah to commemorate that. Judah is killed in 160, but what follows is that Judah's brothers, two of his brothers, become the head of the community in Judea and become the high priest, because the Hasmonean family, where Judah and his brothers came from, were a priestly family. But they were not of the descendants of Zadok, therefore they were not one of the families in which the high priest was selected. And what you have for the first time is the line of the high priest passes from the original line to the Hasmoneans. And that's why we call this the Hasmonean period, and it lasts about 80 years. And during this period, you first of all have Judah's brother Jonathan, and then he's killed, and then his brother Simon takes over, and Simon is the first one who is officially kind of both the secular military ruler as well as the high priest. And Simon's son, John Hyrcanus I, not only becomes the high priest, but they start to proclaim themselves kings. And so what you have here are the Hasmonean Kings, these are all of the rulers of them. And this is important because it would appear that during the late Hasmonean period, that's when the Qumran community was established. And the question is, why? And part of it probably had to do with tremendous dissatisfaction about the fact that the Hasmoneans were the high priests when they shouldn't have been. So that is one of the elements, the very important historical elements. And again, scholars are not sure whether the community was founded during the time of Jonathan or John Hyrcanus. Probably John Hyrcanus, probably the latter one. And he is referred to in some of the sectarian texts as the wicked priest. Okay? So it's very likely during his period that the Qumran community is established, and we'll discuss why that happened. But what happens is that eventually there is a civil war between the sons of Salome Alexandra, Shlomo Tzion Hamalka, and one of them calls the Romans in. And the Romans come in under Pompey in 63. Pompey the Great conquers Jerusalem, and Judea becomes part of the Roman Empire. So from 63 BCE until the 4th century, well, really the CE, or even till the Muslim conquest, Eretz Yisrael is under the Romans. Now, originally, the Romans had direct rule over Judea, which means they had a sub-governor, because it wasn't a big enough territory to have a full governor, which is called a prefect. But in 37 BCE, Augustus gives the territory of Judea and surrounding areas to Herod. Herod is Jewish, but he's of Idumean descent. That's an important thing. There were different kinds of Jews at the time. There were Judean Jews, there were Galilean Jews, and there were Idumean Jews. And the Idumeans had probably descended from the Edomites, and they had been forcibly converted to Judaism by John Hyrcanus. So he was not ethnically Judean, but he was religiously Judean. He married into one of the last descendants of the Hasmoneans, and ended up killing her like he did most of his wives. And Herod had direct rule over, while being part of the Roman Empire, had direct rule over Eretz Yisrael until the 4 CE, when he died. His kingdom is split into 3 for his 3 sons, and within a couple of years, the son that controls Judea did such a bad job. Augustus basically fires him and puts a direct rule back in. And from that point until the war against the Romans are ruling Judea directly. This is the Roman Empire at the time. except for Britain, that was a little later. And the Roman Empire, of course, was the largest empire in the world at the time, and one of its important thing was the only group that could oppose the Romans in any kind of way were the Parthians, the descendants of the Persian Empire on the eastern border. So you can understand why this area is strategic. And Herod is a very good vassal king, and he, of course, builds enormous amounts of things in his kingdom, including Masada, including he rebuilds the temple into the largest religious compound in the ancient world. He creates the port city of Caesarea, and plus a whole bunch of other things. And when the Romans take on direct rule, the headquarters for the Roman government is in Caesarea. Okay, so during one of the I said prefect, it's procurator. One of the procurators over this period of time, and most of them were really bad administrators because they basically got their jobs by being friends of the imperial family, was a guy named Pontius Pilate, who was from 26 to 36 CE. He did such a terrible job, they exiled him to like some dinky little place on the Black Sea. And it was during the time of Pontius Pilate that Jesus, or Joshua of Nazareth, had his period where he lived and, as the Christians call it, did his ministry, and put to death by Pontius Pilate for a variety of reasons. In the year 40, the Emperor Caius Caligula, who succeeds Tiberius, who had succeeded Augustus, tries to put a statue of himself in the Jerusalem temple. And this causes major riots throughout the empire, wherever there are Jewish communities. And it's only because Gaius is assassinated before the statue actually gets to Jerusalem that full-scale revolt doesn't break out. But some 20 years later, revolt during the time of Nero, the revolt does break out. And it starts in the year 66. And it starts with a series of riots in Caesarea and in Jerusalem. In 68 is probably when Qumran was destroyed. In 70, Jerusalem falls and is destroyed, and Masada falls sometime between 72 and 74. And that's the end. Here's a map showing where the concentrations of Jews were in the Roman Empire. You can see they're mostly in the eastern part of the empire, here, and probably also off the map up in this area. But Jerusalem is one of the major centers, so is Alexandria, so is Antioch, and there's a community in Rome from the time of Julius Caesar. And in fact, every province of the Roman Empire, there has been found archaeological evidence for Jewish communities, including on the Rhine, which is the wild border of the northeast border of the empire, in Germany, what is now Germany, Cologne. The only place we don't find any evidence of Jewish habitation during the Roman period is Britain. At least it's never been found. Okay? This is what the area, this was Herod's kingdom. It was made up of all these particular parts. This is Judea, this is Samaria, this is the Galilee, this is Idumea here, where the Idumeans come from, and various other places, and it was a mixed population. Some areas were heavily Jewish, Judea and the Galilee, but there were other places where there were significant Greek-speaking populations. And this was how, so he had this whole territory, but this was how it was divided up when he died. Anybody have any questions at this particular point? Yes?
Do we have maps drawn in those days? These are modern maps that we've...
These are modern maps that are based upon ancient documents. There actually was a giant map of the city of Rome that was made in a marble wall in Rome, which they have found 20% of, and they've tried to reconstruct it. There were maps, but we don't really have any that actually survived from that period, but not what we would call detailed maps. Any other questions? Okay, So one of the most important characteristics of the second half of the Second Temple period is that the Jewish world in Judea, the Galilee, were divided up according to sectarian groups or sects. There doesn't appear to be sects outside of Judea and the Galilee. The Jewish community of Alexandria, the Jewish community on Cyprus, in the Greek areas, in Rome, there doesn't appear to be that kind of sectarianism. We're not quite sure why, but in the land of Israel itself, there is tremendous religious diversity, and there are a number of sects. And this, according to my teacher, Professor Shia Cohen, now at Yale, in his wonderful book From the Maccabees to the Mishnah, this is how he defines a sect. It is a small, organized group that separates itself from a larger religious body and asserts that it alone embodies the ideals of the larger group because it alone understands God's will. You got that? A sect is not a different religion, but a subgroup within a religious group. And we have evidence of a certain number of what we might call sects, Jewish sects. When did this start? That's a good question. We have some evidence from late biblical texts that there was a certain amount of sectarianism even before the destruction of the first temple. And that there is in the book of Jeremiah, in chapter 35 of the book of Jeremiah, the description of a group called the Rechabites. And this is in the last years of Judea, who'd been around for several generations. Their clan had created their own covenant that they were not to live in cities, they were not to do agricultural work, they had to live out not in the deep desert, but on the edges of the settled area, in tents, and they only herded flocks. In other words, they were trying to live like the patriarchs. And they had been around for several generations by the time of Jeremiah, and they had, because of the attack of the Babylonian army, they had resettled themselves inside Jerusalem to save themselves. So we don't know anything about them other than what's in chapter 35 of the book of Jeremiah, but they have a certain number of sectarian characteristics. There also seems to be some early Second Temple texts which suggest that there may have been what scholars call proto-sectarianism, in other words, subgroups within the Judean community. And the books that were found at Qumran that they didn't write, but they venerated, like the Temple Scroll and the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees and other books like that, may come from some unknown sectarian groups that predate the Qumran people. Okay? Anybody have any questions about that? This is a really big issue in scholarly discussions about this period of time and the Qumran community. Was there a sectarian group at Qumran, and who were they? Yes?
Were they zealots, and how did they protect their beliefs?
Well, that's a good question. We'll get to the zealots, because the zealots, in fact, are one of the sects. The question is, were this group at Qumran part of the zealots? The answer is probably no, but let's take a look. So, the ones that we know about during the time of the Qumran community are the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, the Sicarii, and the Zealots, who are not the same group, actually, but the reason why I put them together is because they are militant sectarians. They believed in revolt against the Roman Empire. The Zealots especially were a big part of the revolutionary forces in the war against Rome. The Sicarii were a group of Jewish terrorists who spent most of their time assassinating other Jews who they thought collaborated with the Romans. Okay, whether they were a sect, but they were certainly nationalists similar to what then became the Zealots. The Zealots are after the Sicarii, and the word Sicarii comes from is a Latin word that comes from a Greek word meaning assassin, and it comes from a sickle-shaped knife that they used for assassination. The Samaritans, they may not be considered a sect, but they have sectarian characteristics because they weren't Jews. They didn't see themselves as part of the Jewish community. They were in Samaria. They had originally had their own temple, but we might include them as a kind of sectarian group because they believed they understood the Torah, they had their own practices, and they saw themselves as being very distinct from the rest, from the Jews. They weren't Jews, they were Samaritans. The Therapeutai. The Therapeutai, which we don't actually know what the name means, was the only sectarian group that we have evidence for outside the land of Israel. They are described by only one person, that's Philo of Alexandria, who was a Jewish philosopher at the end of the 1st century BCE, beginning of the 1st century CE, and they were evidently a co-ed, men and women group of celibates who lived in a monastic community on the outskirts of Alexandria. And he has a whole book that he wrote describing them, and they seem very similar to the Essenes, only they're co-ed. And they're the only group that we know of outside the land of Israel. And of course, one of the most famous sectarian groups from a little later, not during the, in the latter part of the Qumran period, is the Jesus followers. And I'm not calling them Christians because they weren't called that originally, and most scholars call them the followers of Jesus of Nazareth. We may also include in that group, a prior group, the followers of John the Baptist, who was not a Jesus follower. Jesus was a follower of John. And there's a possibility that, number one, John was an Essene, and or he came from the Qumran community. There's a very good chance that John had come from the Qumran community because he did his activities in the Jordan River Valley near Jericho, so that's not far from Qumran. And the kinds of things that he was advocated sound a lot like the people at Qumran. Yeah.
Do these sectarians consider themselves as an autonomous group or a part of the Jewish nation, if you will, or how did they view themselves as speakers for the religion, for everybody else? Or
they believed that the vast majority of Jews were following a path to hell, and they're the ones who only had the truth. So, for example, there's a book from the Qumran community called The Wars of the Sons of Light Against the Sons of Darkness. Who are the sons of darkness? Not the Romans, they're fellow Jews. And in fact, we think that the Qumran people hated the most, aside from the religious establishment in Jerusalem, were the Pharisees. They were probably their big enemies. So it's an internal Jewish thing, and I'm glad you asked that question, because in Jewish sectarianism, it has to do with very certain specific issues, okay? What is it that divided these groups? In early Christianity, there was a lot of sectarianism. And what divided the early Christians from each other, or I'm talking like the 2nd and 3rd century CE, was theology. What was the nature of Jesus? What was the nature of the Trinity? And all kinds of stuff like that. That was their big arguments that divided Christianity. Eventually, there was an orthodoxy created in Christianity in the year 325, the Nicene Creed, and they basically kicked everybody else out who didn't follow that. Okay? In the Jewish sectarianism, it wasn't so much about theology, it was about practice. And this is very typically that Judaism was not a creedal religion. It didn't rely on a specific creed, but rather a set of practices that everybody followed. So what did people follow in the Second Temple period? If you were a Jew, no matter where you lived, I mean, there were a lot of Jews, and first of all, Jews didn't speak Hebrew anymore, except for some scholars. A lot of Jews spoke Aramaic, because that had been the the language of the Persian Empire. There were a lot of Jews who spoke Greek, and there were Jews who spoke Latin, and they were in all these communities around the Roman Empire. So what is it that they all did that was similar? You could probably guess some of them. Number one, they circumcised their sons. That was one of the most important boundary issues that separated a Jew from a non-Jew. Secondly, they kept some form of kosher. They didn't eat pig. What else they didn't eat? I don't know. I don't know. It's not likely they separated meat and milk in the way the Rabbinic Judaism did, but we know that Jews were known for not eating pork. Okay? The third thing was they kept the Sabbath. Again, not necessarily what Rabbinic Judaism later defines as Sabbath practice, but Jews didn't work on the Sabbath. And we know this from non-Jewish writers who attack the Jews for being lazy because they take one day out of 7 off. Okay, so those are the 3 big ones, but in addition to that, there were the purity laws. This was especially important in Jerusalem where the temple was, because you were not supposed to go into the temple if you were in a state of impurity, like if you had touched a dead body, or if a woman had been menstruating, or all kinds of, there was a very elaborate purity system based on the book of Leviticus. And that's where you get the idea of the mikveh from. Immersing yourself in water is a way to purify yourself from these things. So between some of the sectarians, there was a lot of arguments over the details of the purity laws. And that's important. Then there was the calendar. We all have the same calendar now, but not all Jews had the same calendar back then. And there were arguments over whether the Jewish year was a solar year, whether it was a lunar year, or the way it is now, which is a lunar year corrected by a solar, so that we always have Passover in the spring. Is the new year in the spring or is it in the fall? All these things, there were differences. And one of the things we have found at Qumran is a calendar. And they had, it's different than the calendar that we have today. And they had certain festivals that don't exist today. Okay? They had their own festivals that don't exist. So the calendar was important. But the most critical thing in some ways was the temple. All Jews in the Second Temple period venerated the temple in Jerusalem. With a couple of minor exceptions, it was the only temple the Jews had. It was the center of the Jewish world. And people went on pilgrimage. I've said this before, but the Hebrew word for a festival in which you're supposed to go to Jerusalem in Hebrew is called Chag. It's the exact Hebrew equivalent of the Arabic Hajj. Jews used to go on Hajj, especially on Passover and Sukkot. They would come by hundreds of thousands of them to crowd into Jerusalem. So this was a really important part of Jews' lives. And travel then was not so easy. So if a person got to go there once in their life, that was a big deal. Okay, so the temple is the holiest place in the world. And so everybody venerated the temple, but the sectarian groups disagreed on how it should be run and who should be running it. And the legitimacy of the high priesthood was a very serious issue in this period. Because the high priesthood, the office of the high priest became an office that the Romans were the ones who ultimately appointed the high priest. And even though the high priest had to be of a certain descent, it became a political office. And the high priest actually had a lot of power in Jerusalem. And one of his jobs was to make sure there weren't any problems when all these Jews crowded into Jerusalem. And inevitably, riots would break out and Romans would then put it down very viciously, killing people. And the high priest tries to keep the peace. But there were groups of sectarians who felt that the high priest was illegitimate. And therefore, in the case of our community at Qumran, they thought the whole temple was illegitimate. And they left. The illegitimacy of the temple is something that hangs over the whole period. And it comes from two reasons. When the second temple is built to replace the first temple, the initial second temple is nowhere near as beautiful or elaborate as Solomon's temple. So there's a certain sense it was a kind of schleppedik version. Okay? Secondly, in the Torah, when the tabernacle is dedicated, a cloud comes down into the tabernacle representing the physical presence of God. In the first book of Kings, chapter 8, when Solomon dedicates the temple, a cloud comes down to inhabit the Holy of Holies in the temple. So the presence of God was in the tabernacle, according to these texts, and then in Solomon's temple, and that gave it legitimacy and holiness. Well, when you read the description of the dedication of the second temple, no cloud comes down. So there's a certain sense in which there may have been a kind of whiff of illegitimacy about the whole temple itself. And when Herod rebuilds the temple, well, he's Jewish, but some people may have thought he wasn't Jewish enough. And of course, there were a lot of people who hated Herod because he had to tax a lot, and they saw him as a foreigner. And some of the militant groups didn't want a foreigner ruling over the Jewish people. That was one of the things that caused the outbreak of the revolt. Okay? So there's a certain sense where even Herod's temple, as big and beautiful as it was, had a whiff of illegitimacy about it. So all of these things are what contributes to the growth of these sects. Anybody have any questions at this particular point? Okay? All right. So, what do we know? Where do we get all this information about Jewish sectarianism? Well, we have sources in Greek and we have sources in Hebrew and Aramaic. The sources in Greek, our major sources are, and these are not in order of chronological order, Josephus. Josephus is a Jew who was a general in the Jewish army in the revolt against Rome. He's captured by the Romans and he changes sides. He survives the war. He becomes the Roman emperor, and the several Roman emperors over the course of the rest of his life become his patrons. Okay? And Josephus writes a history of the war. He writes it in Aramaic, but it's translated into Greek. We do not have the Aramaic original. And then 10 years later or so, and he lives from around 30 to around the year 100. We know when he was born because he told us. He writes an autobiography. By the way, his autobiography is the first autobiography in Western literature. But we think he died around the year 100 because he kind of disappears at that point. But around 90, he publishes a history of the Jews called the Antiquities of the Jews, which covers from the creation of the world all the way down to his own time. So Josephus is an incredibly important source for the history of this period because he also had access to all kinds of sources and information, and he had because the emperors were his patrons, Vespasian and Titus, he had access to their archives. He knew some of the central players in the revolt, the generals and everybody else. So he had really good sources for the war. The Antiquities, he had to rely on the Bible and earlier sources and things of that sort. Philo is the Jewish philosopher who lives in Alexandria, born around the year 30 BCE, dies around the year 50 CE, say 50 CE, and he is a philosopher, the first major Jewish philosopher, and he writes in Greek. He doesn't know Hebrew. He reads the Bible in Greek, and most of his works are philosophical works, but he has some important historical works because he came from one of the most prominent Jewish family in the Roman Empire. His family was probably one of the wealthiest families in the Roman Empire. They served Augustus and other emperors in terms of estate management. They were the heads of the Jewish community in Alexandria, which was a hugely, And he's kind of like the scholar. His brother is the one who goes into the family business, and he's kind of like, he's the older brother who decides he doesn't want to go into the family business. He wants to go to university and become a philosopher. But late in life, he is forced to take a community leadership role in a delegation that goes to the emperor Caligula because of some riots that broke out in Alexandria. And he describes it. And Josephus actually mentions him in his history of the events that Philo describes. So Philo, we know from, Philo doesn't write an autobiography, but he drops all kinds of autobiographical, information. And we know he went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem at one point. He says so. He doesn't tell us much about it, but he's our source for the Therapeutai. He also mentions the Essenes. He doesn't mention the Sadducees, the Pharisees, but he's a very important source for this period. Pliny was a Roman geographer, and as you will see, he also mentions the Essenes. And what's really important is when you take a look at it again, you'll see that he actually places an Essene settlement right where Qumran is. Okay? And we have the New Testament. In other words, if you look at the earliest texts of the New Testament in the Gospels and the book of Acts and some of the letters of Paul, the Sadducees and the Pharisees are mentioned. The Essenes are not. In Hebrew, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we have rabbinic literature, where the Pharisees are mentioned and the Sadducees are mentioned, but not the Essenes. In addition to that, there's all kinds of other literature of the period, ancient literature, that some of which might be associated with some of these sects. So these are our sources. If you take a look at the material I've given you, I've given you a chart. These are all the theories of who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. In other words, the conventional theory identifies the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls with the Essenes. The question is, when? So the early Essenes would have been around the 140s, which takes them back to the time of the high priest Jonathan, Judah Maccabee's brother. And their reason for creating the group was because this Hasmonean became the high priest instead of the legitimate line of the Zadokites. And Vermeesch really believed this, and also a scholar named DeVoe. There are others who say no, they are later than that, so they start up around 76 BCE. They may have been priests, they may have been proto-Sicarii or Zealots, and they create, because the Pharisees under Salome Alexandra, in effect, according to Josephus, makes the Pharisees the most prominent group in the land. And they don't like the Pharisees, so that's why they break away and start this. There are people who believe that, in fact, they were a group of Sadducees, a dissident group of Sadducees, and also from around 76 BCE because they didn't like the Pharisaic takeover under Salome. And Lawrence Schiffman, who's a very important Jewish scholar of the Second Temple period, that's his theory. Another Israeli scholar named Rachel Elior believes that the Qumran group were a group of dissident priests. They were neither Essenes or Sadducees, but they were a group of priests who were really angry because Jonathan had become high priest, and so they leave and they form this little community. There's a possibility that it's a totally different group that we haven't known, and they call themselves the Achad. They never call themselves Essenes, and it's just a different sectarian group. I mean, that's certainly what some people think. And there are some people who say, and this is no longer really, that there really wasn't a group at Qumran, that what you had was just a bunch of books that were preserved by people because of the war, and they brought all these from Jerusalem. They brought this library from Jerusalem, and they just stuck it in the caves. Okay? I don't think, most scholars don't believe that. At this point, most scholars do believe that whoever lived in that place called Qumran had a direct connection with the scrolls that were found in the caves. And the conventional theory is they were Essenes. And that's the one that I personally accept. Any questions at this particular point? I know this is a lot to take in, but it's important because it gives you a context for when we actually look at the material itself. MMT is a document found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that seems to be a proclamation or a letter from the people at Qumran to a religious authority in Jerusalem, basically saying, this is why we left. You believe this, we believe that. You believe this, but the problem is it's fragmentary. And Schiffman believes if you look at those, and we're going to look at it, if you look at those differences, it seems to describe a very similar series of arguments in early rabbinic literature between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. These halachic differences. But it's not, I don't know, most people don't accept that. Okay? So, here, yes.
When does early rabbinic literature start?
It starts in the 2nd century. So it's 200, it's almost 200 years after the Qumran community is destroyed. Okay? But early rabbinic literature, it's hard to date, but sometimes it preserves ancient traditions that predate it, going back to the Second Temple period. Okay, so here is the text from Pliny the Elder, who was a Roman who lived between, a geographer and historian who lived between 23 and 79. And by the way, he was killed in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius at Pompeii. His nephew Pliny the Younger actually describes how his uncle died. But anyway, Pliny wrote a very important work called The Natural History, which basically goes through every province in the Roman Empire, telling you about who lived there and all kinds of stuff about it. So when he gets to the area of Judea, he has this paragraph. And he says, lying on the west of Asphalites, that's the Dead Sea, asphalt, right? And sufficiently distant to escape its noxious exaltations are the Essenes, a people that live apart from the world, marvelous beyond all others throughout the whole earth, for they have no women among them. No sexual desire, they are strangers. Money they have none. The palm trees are their only companions. Day after day, however, their numbers are fully recruited by multitudes of strangers that resort to them, driven thither to adopt their usages by the tempest of fortune and wearied with the miseries of life. In other words, people retire into the monastery, which we know happened in the Middle Ages. And women went into convents for the same reason. There was, if they were widows and they had nobody to support them at that point, they would retire into the convent. And by the way, that happens with Buddhist monks and nuns. Okay, so you get to a point in your life where, okay, enough is enough. I don't feel like working out in the world. Family doesn't care about me or whatever you want to say. And I'm going to go live with spend my last few years in contemplation. And piety. That is through, and he says thousands of ages. In other words, he thinks it's a really ancient community when it's only about 100 years old when he's writing this. Incredible to relate, this people eternally prolongs its existence without a single birth taking place there. Well, that's how all monastic communities work. Okay? And he mentions En-Gedi, that's what he calls here En-Gada. Second only to Jerusalem in the fertility of its soil and its groves of the palm trees. And he mentions Masada. Okay? So this is one of the most important references to the Essenes, and it places an Essene community right where Qumran is, west of the Dead Sea. So this is one of the most important pieces of evidence for identifying the Qumran people with the Essenes. And we'll look at some more evidence next week. Now, Josephus has the most complete descriptions of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Sectarian and the Zealots, scattered throughout his work. He has about 6 or 7 major expositions on them, and he mentions them a bunch of other times as well. And if you take a look at the material I've given you, this is a paragraph I forgot to put in the material, that's why I got it up there. take a look at what he has here. This is the bottom of page 4. Would somebody like to begin reading that?
The Jews from the most ancient times had two philosophies that came into their traditions, that of the Essenes, that of the
Sadducees.
Sadducees, and thirdly that of a group called the Pharisees. The Pharisees simplified their standard of living, making no concession to luxury. They followed the guidance of that which their doctrine has selected and transmitted as good, attaching the chief importance to observances of those commandments, which it has seen fit to dictate to them. They show deference and respect to their elders, nor do they rashly presume to contradict their proposals. Though they postulate that everything is brought about by fate, still they do not deprive the human will of the pursuit of what is in man's power, since it was God's good pleasure that there should be a fusion, and that the will of man with his virtue and vices should be admitted to the council chamber of faith.
Okay, so he's writing this for a non-Jewish audience. So he refers to them as schools of philosophy. That's something that Greeks and Romans would understand. Okay? So, and when he actually compares in various places, the Pharisees are like this group of Greek philosopher, the Stoics or whatever, this group is like that group. So notice he's emphasizing their belief system because that's something, again, the Greeks would and Romans would understand. And when you look at what he says about them, we know that the Pharisees are the core of what ends up becoming the rabbis. And notice he says they believe in determination, what he calls fate. Again, that's a term Greeks would understand, but they also believe in free will. And we have in rabbinic literature this belief that God both directs things and there is human free will. It sounds contradictory, but that's what the rabbis believed. Okay? And he goes on to talk about their belief of what happens after death. They believe that the soul survives death, there's reward and punishment. They also, and then they say, because of these views, they are, as a matter of fact, extremely influential among the townsfolk, and all prayers and sacred rites of divine worship are performed according to their exposition. And they live in the cities. So the Pharisees are the largest group and seem to have the most influence. That's what Josephus is claiming. In his autobiography, he claims he was a Pharisee. Ultimately, he tried out being an Essene and then decided to become a Pharisee. But actually, we have no evidence in his earlier works that he was a Pharisee, but he was from a priestly family. But the fact is that this is a pretty good description of what the early rabbis believed. Okay. The second group, he says, is the Sadducees, who hold that the soul perishes along the body. In other words, they don't believe in an afterlife. They own no observance of any sort apart from the laws. In other words, whereas the Pharisees have their oral traditions, the Sadducees stick only to the written Torah. That's it. Okay? And they reckon it a virtue to dispute with the teachers of the path of wisdom that they pursue. There are but few men to whom this doctrine has been made known, but these are men of the highest standings. In other words, they're the upper class. They accomplish practically nothing, however, for whenever they assume some office, though they submit willingly and perforce, yet must submit they do to the formulas of the Pharisees. The assumption is the Sadducees, for the most part, are the upper class, the nobility within the Jewish community, and a large part of the priesthood. Okay? Then he gets to the Essenes. And the Essenes believe that there is no free will. And they talk about the soul is immortal. They send offerings to the temple, but perform their sacrifices employing a different ritual of purification. For this reason, they are barred from those precincts of the temple that are frequented by all the people and perform their rites by themselves. There's a special part of the temple for the Essenes that shows you how sectarian they are. And they talked about, he's got a much larger section devoted to them, but they do agricultural labor, and it talks about, he says there's about 4,000 of them. And this is, they don't have wives into the community, they don't own slaves. So what he is describing here is a celibate group of men. In another part, he suggests that there were kind of followers of the Essenes who were non-celibate, who did marry. So there were kind of two layers. You had the core, the elite, who were celibate men, and then you had a broader group of people who supported them. And by the way, that's kind of the way, for example, the Eastern religion, the Jainism, that's kind of that way that works. They've got a small group of elite priests who are the strictest in terms of practice, and they're celibate, and you have a larger group of Jains who practice some of the practices, but not as strictly as their priests, and they're not celibate. Okay? Then, and I forgot to give this with you, he talks about the fourth sect of Jewish philosophy. These are the militant groups. And he talks about how a guy named Judas from the Galilee was the start of this. They agree in all things with the Pharisees' notion, but they have an inviolable attachment to liberty. Again, this is within an idiom that Romans and Greeks would understand, and say that God is to be their only ruler and Lord. They also do not value dying any kinds of death, nor indeed do they heed the deaths of their relations and friends. In other words, and he thinks he's really against this group. Even though he's part of the revolt at the beginning, he constantly attacks these people as bringing about the destruction of they're the ones responsible for the destruction of the temple and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. So he really hates them. He refers to them as brigands and all kinds of other things. But this is the group which we would include the Sicarii and the Zealots. And the people at Masada were Sicarii. They weren't Zealots, they were Sicarii. Any final questions before we conclude today? All right. So this is one of the most important characteristics of Judaism of the period is sectarianism. The question is, are the Dead Sea Scroll people, are they Essenes? The answer is probably yes. And whereas our accounts of the Essenes come from people who were not part of their group, although Josephus did join the Essenes for a period during his teenage years when he was a spiritual seeker. If we assume that the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls are Essenes, the scrolls that they wrote for themselves are the most important documents of trying to understand the dynamics of their group, their practices, and their worldview.